A 24-year-old cosmonaut is alone inside a sealed pressure chamber on the 10th and final day of an isolation test, when a small piece of cotton lands on a hot plate and the pure oxygen around him turns the air itself into fuel. It will take rescuers agonizing minutes to safely open the door. By then, it is already too late. Stay to the end, because the Soviet Union kept his name out of its own history for 25 years, erasing him from a program that later celebrated every other name in his class. In 1960, the Soviet Union selected its first group of 20 cosmonaut candidates, elite fighter pilots chosen in secret to compete for the honor of becoming the first human in space. Valentin Bondarenko, just 23 years old, was the youngest of them. Training was brutal and experimental because almost nothing about long-term human survival in space was actually known yet. One required test was an extended isolation experiment, 10 straight days alone, sealed inside a small pressure chamber, breathing a low-pressure, oxygen-rich atmosphere meant to simulate certain spacecraft conditions. By March 23, 1961, Bondarenko had nearly finished his 10 days. He was removing medical sensors that had been taped to his skin throughout the test, cleaning the adhesive residue off with a cotton pad soaked in alcohol, a completely routine step.
He tossed the used cotton aside. It landed on exposed electric hot plate used to warm food inside the chamber. In an atmosphere that was almost pure oxygen, a spark that would have been harmless in ordinary air instead ignited instantly. Fire spread through the small chamber in seconds, feeding on an atmosphere that made almost anything flammable, including the fabric of Bondarenko's own suit. He was trapped inside a sealed environment specifically designed to be difficult to open quickly.
Opening a pressurized chamber too fast risked dangerous, potentially fatal decompression. Rescuers had to depressurize it in a controlled way before the door could be safely opened, a process that, in an emergency like this, cost minutes that could not be spared. By the time Bondarenko was pulled from the chamber, he had suffered burns over nearly his entire body. He was rushed to a Moscow hospital, conscious enough, according to later accounts, to apologize to the doctors treating him and to ask that no one else be blamed. He died roughly 16 hours later, becoming the first cosmonaut candidate to die in the Soviet space program, less than 3 weeks before Yuri Gagarin's historic flight made the country famous for putting the first human in space. The Soviet Union did not announce his death publicly. His name and photograph were quietly removed from official material about the first cosmonaut group. For decades, Western analysts studying Soviet space photos noticed a gap, a face that seemed to have simply vanished from the record. The full story didn't reach the public until the mid-1980s, during the glasnost era of openness under Mikhail Gorbachev, a full 25 years after Bondarenko's death, when Soviet officials finally acknowledged what had happened and confirmed his name. Bondarenko's death, kept secret as it was, still quietly shaped Soviet safety protocols for oxygen-rich testing environments going forward. Ironically, 7 years later, NASA suffered its own tragedy from almost the identical cause, a 1967 fire inside the pure oxygen cabin of Apollo 1, killing all 3 American astronauts aboard, a disaster that might have been better anticipated had Bondarenko's death been known outside the Soviet Union at the time. When his name finally resurfaced in the 1980s, Bondarenko was formally added back into official histories of the first cosmonaut group, 20 of the Soviet Union's most celebrated pilots, -1 for 25 years, exactly as long as the silence had lasted. Several of his surviving classmates, by then decorated veterans of the Soviet space program themselves, spoke publicly for the first time about a friend they had trained beside and were never permitted to properly mourn out loud. Yuri Gagarin became the most famous name in the history of spaceflight. Valentin Bondarenko trained beside him, in the same class, chasing the same dream, and paid for that same dream 3 weeks earlier
in a room nobody was allowed to talk about for a generation. Every space program's list of firsts hides a shorter, quieter list of names that were never allowed to be first at all. If the hidden cost behind the space race's biggest triumphs keeps pulling you in, subscribe. There are more true stories from space's stranger, darker corners still to come.